I've never been happy with the chalk cliff face on the southern line, so today I make some improvements. Keep watching to find out how I did it. Hi everyone, I'm Martin and welcome back to Donnington Castle Model Railway. And in today's video, I'm going to be working on some scenic modelling on a chalk cliff on the southern line. Now this is a good example of the way that I am building the layout. Insofar as I am working on areas, getting them to about where I'm about 80% happy with them, and then moving on to other areas because I've got a lot to build, but also that I know that when I come back to those areas to try and get them from 80% to somewhere closer to me being happier with them, that I'm going to be a better modeler and that'll be an easier process. Now today I'm going to show you an area of the layout that I probably moved on from when I was maybe 50% happy with it, and it was always niggling away at me. And so today I'm going to go back to that and revisit it and try and get it up to a standard where I am much happy with it. And that is the chalk cliff on the southern line. It was one of the first things that I built on the layout. Now, what I'll do is I'll get you up to speed with how I got to this point. And then in order to move forwards, I thought that it would be good to go do some research, go look at an actual chalk cliff in this area, and then use that for some inspiration to hopefully elevate that area of the layout and get it looking better by the end of this process. So let me get you caught up with how I got to this point. And I will warn you that I built this before I really started videoing the layout. And therefore, there's probably very little footage of the very beginnings of this. But hopefully I'll be able to show you how I got to this point. So the cliff face is on the front right-hand side of the layout where the southern lines come out of the tunnel. So I started making this part of the layout and landscaping before all the track was laid because I needed to put that tunnel in to get that top baseboard down to then lay the tracks over the top of it. And that's the main reason why I started any of the scenics before I finished track laying. Now, as you can see from these videos, I sculpted some land and then used a woodland scenics mold to create the main rock face. And I thought that was a good idea. It was then painted up using the same techniques I'd used on some of the other rocks. And then I used some ivy and some other vegetation around the edges just to try and improve things. But whilst it looked like a cliff face, it didn't look like chalk, which is what I was really going for. And so I've never been happy with it. Okay, now that's where we are today. So how are we going to improve things there? Well, on a recent train journey, I was looking out of the window and I spotted what looked like a chalk cliff on the Great Western Main Line between Reading and Didcot. So I had a look on my phone where we were for the location, and we'd just gone through Pangbourne in Berkshire. And so I thought I'd do a bit of research and try and find out what that cliff was. Unfortunately, it's not in a great place for public domain photos to exist of it. So what I thought I'd do is head over to Pangbourne and see if we can get a closer look at that cliff and use it as some inspiration for the next phases of modelling. Now, for those of you who don't know, Pangbourne is a small, well, I guess you'd call it a large village west of Reading by the River Thames and on the Great Western Main Line. Most infamous, I guess, for the 7 deadly villas, which are 7 houses that were built at the turn of the 20th century, I think it was. There's also a very nice cheese shop in Pangbourne if you're ever that way. But we're interested in the white cliff there that looks like it's made of chalk. So let's head out and see what we can find.
And welcome to Pangbourne Station, here on the Great Western Main Line between Reading and Didcot Parkway. But we're not here to see the Class 387 on the stopping service from Paddington to Didcot. We're here to see something around and over the back here. And this brick wall, which is suddenly taking a path upwards, is a bit of a clue to what's down here. And peeking through here is what we've come to look at. Looking behind the buddleia and the trees and the nettles is a chalk cutting that the railway was originally cut through at the western end of the station. Let's get a better view of that. And if I point my camera through this metal fence, we can see what I really came to look at, which is the chalk cliff that you can see very clearly from the train as you go through this area. This will give us a really good prototype on which to get the vegetation right back on the layout. So the things that I'm noticing is that the vegetation is fairly random. There are obvious places where things have got a good grip into the rock surface and have got going. But this mixture of cover from the bottom, things coming down from the top, and then things embedded along the cliff face, which is more evident from this view over here. I think they're the key features that we'll want to take back with us, and obviously get a sense of some of the plant species. Buddleias are obviously very clear and common and obvious at this time of the year. We've also got trees. I don't know if I want to put any trees in front of our example, but I think this was a very useful trip. Take this footage back and use that in the next step. Now we've been to Pangbourne, let's take a look at this with fresh eyes and see what we might want to keep or get rid of. So firstly, this ivy up the side here, I think that was fits well with what we saw, and I'll keep that. What I do want to change is these lumps and bumps on this face. They've obviously come from the mould, but they're not really fitting with the whole chalk cliff vibe, so I'm going to get rid of them, even if that means losing some of my work trying to weather that up. To do that, we'll get rid of all of the greenery that's around on here. That should just come off fairly easily. Then we're going to want some falls of material down the bottom, so we can do that, and then have vegetation coming down from the top and up from the bottom, and then some patchy bits at convenient locations in the middle. So next step's going to be to get the greenery off and then mix up some plaster mix that I can use to smooth that off just a touch down the bottom there. So start out with an old takeaway container, and to that we're going to add some plaster of Paris, just this ordinary cheap stuff, not measuring any of this out, so that's just sun, and then some wall grout as well. Now the thing is, I don't have any white, so I'm using grey here, so that might mean we need to do a little bit of painting afterwards. And then to this mix, rather than adding water, I'm going to add a 50-50 PBA water mix. And what I found by using this in the past is that gives you a sticky plaster substance that will be very useful, but can also be shaped and if necessary, have a little bit of texture left on it. So good stir up, and we end up with this consistency. As you can see, it's quite solid and sticky, but you'll also notice that it's grey. Ideally we'd want this white, but we can solve that problem a little bit later. So I'm going to take a spreading tool and add that onto the existing surface, trying to fill in those gaps. As you can see, it will turn out later that this approach of smoothing things off using this tool was not the right approach, and so what I'm doing now is using a clay working tool just to add some lines, some horizontal lines across here to represent the layers we saw in the chalk cliff. So at this point, I still think that this is going to work out, but you'll have to bear with me a little bit as we go down the rabbit hole, and then we can come back out again. So yeah, just getting a little bit of texture into that surface there. And when that's done, you can see that we're left with a fairly smooth looking cliff face. Now, as a little bit of a side note, I'm not going to throw away the excess mixture. What I'm going to use this for is to create some rock fall. So
What I've done is wait for that to go a little bit hard, and then rotated the plastic tub slightly to crack the bits off, and you'll see very sharp looking bits of rock there. I think the more jagged you want your rocks to be, the more you'd leave this. But what I want, with chalk being quite a soft rock, is to actually round these off. So give them a little bit of shape, but then put the lid of the takeaway container on there, and then just give that a real good shake. And then those rocks bashing against each other will round the corners off slightly. And the more you keep shaking, the more you'll end up with a much softer, rounder rock. And you'll also notice we've got a good mix of grades in there, so we can use some of the bigger bits for big bits of rockfall, and then some of the little chunks to make it look like things have fallen down. Next thing I am doing is grabbing some cheap hobbycraft paint, and I'm going to use that to start colouring the rock face. So I've used the white, and then I've gone over with the cream. You need a few layers of this stuff because it's only poster paint. You could technically use acrylics, but I had these two to hand. Now, to try and improve the look of it, because I wasn't happy, I went in and added some panel line wash and some grey and some green bits of paint. Look a complete mess. But then what I did was then went back over the top of that with those paints, and because they're not very thick, you then see some of that texture from underneath coming through. Then I still wasn't happy with the effect I was getting, so I added a few vertical or diagonal lines in by digging into that plaster surface. You can see the rockfall that's been added down the bottom with some of those big boulders, and then some of the infill that could be tidied up in a little bit. But I really wasn't happy with the way things were going, and I thought the only way of doing it was to add some more texture onto the surface. So I mixed up some plaster, and this time some of that hobbycraft paint, to create a creamy colour mixture that I then applied onto that cliff face. That poster paint and plaster of Paris gives a very sticky substance that's using a clay shaping tool. You can just very lightly put across the surface and then use a motion like this just to stipple that. And because it's quite sticky, you get this wonderful texture to it. So coming across in horizontal lines like we see in the chalk, you then get that very rough surface that we're aiming for here. And when that's dry, this is the effect that you end up with. And for me, this is so much better than the previous attempt. It's quite solid, but we've got definite texture to there, and we've got that effect of the lines in the chalk. So now going over the top, I had a bit too much paint on my brush here. So the idea was just to dry brush over the top of it. So that looks quite, I don't know what the word is, a bit overdone. Then going back over the top with that poster paint, and again, because it's quite thin, you'll see it's not as thick as acrylic. And the real advantage of that paint here is you can create a variable effect which hopefully looks more natural and realistic. So let's leave the cliff face for now, as I'm pretty happy with that, and let's think about what we're going to put around it and over the top of it, and that's vegetation. So I went for a rummage through all of the various boxes I've got, containing bits of polyfiber and seafoam and moss. There's a gorse bush I made in a previous episode. We've got some scale model scenery bits and pieces. These are grass roots that I used on the river. They just pulled up from the ground, washed. Another bit of seafoam there. And then that is some twine off an old packet of potatoes. And then I've got some hairspray, some fine turf, and some leaves. The leaves are the ones that I used when I made ivy. And so some of the polyfiber, I've done exactly the same as that. If you're interested, Tim from Scamperton Model Railway had a go at making this recently. I'll put a link up to his channel in the top right if you're interested in having a look at his layout. And then using the seafoam and various other bits, again using the fine turf to coat them, quick spray with a hairspray, and then coat them with that fine turf. Get out the paintbrush and just touch things in either brown or green if the wrong colours are showing through. And then we've got a couple of larger twigs that I've snapped and again painted, and again some fine turf on them just to emulate some moss. Can now go and add this to our cliff face.
So you will see that I have made a bit of progress, and it was my intention to film doing this, but then my imposter syndrome got in the way and I thought I'll make a complete mess of this. Why would I bother filming it? Because I'm just going to rip it out and do it again. But it's not terrible. So let me talk you through how I got to this point. There are still a few little bits to add in here, but I will talk you through the process. So you will notice that I have worked on both the cliff face and on the surrounding area, because as I started working on this, I realized that part of the reason why I wasn't happy was because of the surrounding area. So let's divide this into two. Firstly, the cliff face. And with this, I started out with the biggest pieces first. So using some of the ivy and other bits down the sides and down here. Just using at first some extra hold hairspray just to fix that in place. And down the bottom, one of our little trees and a few little shrubs. And then I dug out some of the buddleia and added those in. Now, I don't think they look particularly like buddleia, so I've tried to hide them in because I'm going to do something else to try and hopefully do a buddleia in a second. I then widened my approach and added in gorse bush up the top here. And then from that point, it was a case of blending those in, because when you do that, add those big pieces in, they look very conspicuous. So I then used Woodland Scenic's underbrush, and that's this dark colour here, to go around all the edges of the big pieces to blend them in. So even things that were here before, I've just worked around those and worked them between each other just to give a sense of those being blended into the landscape. Next, I got some coarse turf and used a couple of different colours and went over the grass down here with all of this. Just sprinkled it on. Because there was already grass there, it caught in it and gave a nice, good coverage. I then blended that across the grass here, just making that peter out a little bit, just so it didn't end suddenly. Then some Woodland Scenics bushes as well, just into some of the gaps. I really just kept working over that until I felt like it was in a good place. Next, I took some fine turf and these particular colours, particularly the earth blend, and sprinkled that over the top, particularly on the transitions between the different colours. And what that does is that gives a much more muted effect, and I think a much more naturalistic effect. Into our cliff face, I just used a pin vise to drill some holes and then poked the stalks of those bits of seafoam in, a dab of PVA, and glued those in place. And you can see where some of the fine scatter got stuck to some of the hairspray that I used to fix things onto that cliff. And that, I think, looks quite nice. I might back that off ever so slightly in the next stage. But as a first step, I think that came out quite well, and it would have been lovely to have had a time lapse of me doing that. I think there are really two approaches you can take to this. One is to have a picture of something in reality that you're going to copy and copy that. The other is to really let go of your conscious brain and just really let your unconscious brain take over and try and do things naturalistically in that way. I think where things look a bit artificial is where you try and overthink things and you almost place things. So in a lot of cases, I've just let things fall. Then when I've come to glue them, if they've slipped down, I've generally left them. because again, I think that gives it a little bit more of a naturalistic look. When it comes to things that stand out, like the purpley pink color, I always go in odd numbers. So that's something I learned from Gardener's World when you're planting plants or bulbs. The brain, for some reason, likes odd numbers. Whenever there are even numbers of things, it thinks that they stick out and look strange. So there are a few more things I need to do to complete this. One is to add some of those vines. Another is I've got a couple of mossy logs. And the final thing is I'm going to try and make some more realistic looking buddleia just to add halfway up that slope. And I think with those, that will all come together very nicely. A quick note about sticking it down. So things were initially stuck with some hairspray, but then what I did was I created what I believe scenic cement is, which was to get a spray bottle and some watered down PVA. In my case, it was about 20% PVA to water. A big dollop of dish soap or washing up liquid, and then use quite a fine spray and just soak the whole area with that. And I don't know if this comes across on camera, but that's given a very nice finish that nothing is really moving now. There's a little bit of flex in it. So that's quite a good effect. When I've done the last couple of bits, we'll probably give it another coat just to be absolutely sure. But that stuck down quite well. As I say, just PVA, washing up liquid and water in a squeezy bottle. Okay, right. I will crack on with doing those last few bits and then hopefully we are all done.
I added those few bits in, particularly the vines. You will also see the buddleia, which are some of those scale model scenery thistles, I think they were, with some of the purple scatter over them, which I think look a lot more like real buddleia. Those are halfway up the cliff. I also finally got around to adding a signal in. That's by Train Tech. I'll talk about signals another day. Let's just do a quick before and after. And I think you'll agree that that is much, much better. And we have quite a nice little scene here with the 4 VEP. So once those southern lines are finished, it'll be a nice place to start running trains from. And we got there finally. So I'm relatively happy with that cliff now, certainly much happier than when I was at the start of this process. I think that I can still make improvements to it, but I think I need to develop and improve as a modeler before I have another go at that. But I guess it's a good case study of how we can always look to improve things on our own layouts and not to necessarily rush into it. That if we feel like we've not done a great job of something, go away, learn some things, look at it with fresh eyes, and then come back and have another go at it. And I think that's something that I've really taken from this process that I don't think I would ever have been able to get to this state of affairs when I first attempted this, and I'm sure I can, as I said, I can improve on this in the future. But that was a lot of fun. I'm not sure where on the layout I'm going to move to next, but I shall certainly have a think and come up with another interesting project to work on. But thank you very much for watching. Please do leave your thoughts on how you think I've done on the cliff in the comments. And I will catch you all on another video very soon. Bye for now.